let's first talk about the political extremes that we see right now. We see sort of this combination almost of far left, far right, this ideologue mentality of extremes. What are your thoughts on exactly how polarizing that is, and how did we get here?
Well, it certainly seems like something has shifted. I guess I can speak more for the country to the south of your border than for Canada, but it seems like the internet has changed everything, and voices, no matter how fringe and crazy, get amplified in ways that they didn't used to. So it's, I think we're seeing the extremes more and more, and there's a kind of a normalizing of the extremity. And in the case of what's happened in the U.S. politically, it's, you know, again, I've complained about this to everyone's exhaustion on my podcast, but it's just, you know, what we've witnessed politically in the U.S., I would have thought was impossible. So now I'm just surprised at my continual capacity for surprise. Nothing should surprise me anymore. I mean, we'll elect someone without a head.
Sarah, what is your take on how the activists have actually been able to construct the narrative rather than, I don't know, the general population?
Well, I think it's interesting the way that we're approaching this idea of truth, that instead of the fact that there might be just an objective reality that we can all reason ourselves into, and we can speak to each other and have conversations and get to a productive place where we both agree, there's this idea that there's just a political narrative that's competing with another political narrative. And I've seen this, in particular, Islam is a place where this is super visible, and it's easy for anyone to see how one side of the political aisle views Islam in a particular way, and that is the narrative that they accept. The sad part is that reality lies somewhere in the middle, and political motivations often blind the way that we see the world, and instead we should be, losing those and trying to adopt a more rational, more compassionate way of looking at the world.
For sure. And do you think that the way the media covers this stuff has anything to do with it? I mean, they're more interested, it seems, in sensationalizing for ratings and things like that than they are presenting the true sides of the issues.
Yeah, well, I think we witnessed that, the real danger of that in the presidential election, because the media clearly wanted to cover it as a horse race up until the last possible moment, and that entailed giving equal scrutiny to truly incompatible errors on both sides. So the fixation on Clinton's emails, for instance, which happened up until the 11th hour, was in the service of giving some kind of just some sort of suspense to this. Because I know people in the media. Again, it's painful to relitigate the presidential election, but I know people who are anchoring news broadcasts the night of, waiting for these election returns, and they were told in advance that Clinton wins in a landslide. So everything you saw on television that night, from like 5 o'clock Eastern on, was news anchors pretending to be in suspense about what was going to happen, being absolutely sure that Clinton was going to win. And then when things turned, around 8 o'clock or so, people were just completely blindsided. They had no idea what they were doing.
We're in Canada, so maybe they don't know. Guys, we had this crazy election. It was nuts down there. Before we get off that topic, I just want to address the right side of politics. And I don't mean correct. I mean the right, the extreme right. Do you think the religious right is still making ground in politics?
Well, they're doing it in the U.S. They're now doing it under the cover of Trump and the non-religious right, or the intolerant right that isn't necessarily thumping Bibles while they while they express their intolerance. So there's no question that the Christian right in the U.S. has made huge gains politically, but they're doing it fairly under the radar because Trump has just catered to their basically every demand in return for their support. So.
You think that he's been so extreme in some areas that it's easy for them to slide in some of their legislation? I mean, I know there's the recent thing where they're sort of allowing churches in America now to donate directly to politicians anonymously, and it's kind of a scary thing, but it's not making the news because of all the other crazy stuff he's saying and tweeting. So he's almost like a big distraction for real things that are going on.
Well, it's a bad sign that even I can't care about it. You know, it's like, I can't think, the fact that I would want Mike Pence to be president, given, I mean, that is the implication of every moment I spend trying to undermine Trump and get him impeached. I seem to want a Christian theocrat in the White House. You can all thank me when that happens. But yeah, it's sort of like, you know, it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, and survival is somewhere. Once you gotta get survival worked out before you worry about whether they teach evolution as a controversial topic.
Sarah?
I think the most, what I was saying earlier, I'll just build on that with one example that I've been thinking about since it happened. Right after President Donald Trump was elected, there were quite a few hate crime incidences, and these were just reported breathlessly by the media, especially those occurring to women who were visibly Muslim, women who wore the hijab. And quite a few, it turned out later, were actually hoaxes, that it didn't actually happen, the women made it up for one reason or another. And it was interesting to me to see on my just own personal social media feeds who shared with their own friends and family the news of the woman who got attacked, and then who shared afterwards when they found out that it was a hoax. And it was so neatly divided into political camps that there was a certain kind of person, maybe liberal leaning, who almost wanted to hear about this event. It was almost as if they were waiting for something like this to happen the second Donald Trump was elected. So this fed into exactly how they saw the world to be, and then they shared that news post. And then afterwards, when it turned out to be a hoax, some people on the right who don't feel too favorably about Muslims found that the fact that it was a hoax fed into their feelings that, you know, Muslims aren't really people who suffer any kind of bigotry in the United States. And it was just the story itself was this one woman in New York City who was attacked. She said that she was attacked or harassed in some way by 3 Donald Trump supporters, and she filed the police bias report. And it turned out later that it was a hoax. What the part of the story that a lot of people didn't focus on and didn't think about was the fact that the woman lied because she was being forced by her dad to live a certain way. She was a hijabi woman. She was dating a Christian guy. She wanted to go out late. She broke her curfew. She wanted an excuse that she could tell her father about that he might believe. So in order to get out of it, she made up this incident. And the terrible thing was, the heartbreaking thing was for me, is to see certain kinds of media outlets report things in different ways, but almost no one caught the real story, which was that here's a woman who's probably being, she's being forced into living a life that she doesn't want to live. Later, you see these pictures of her in the court with her head shaved. Her family had forced her to shave her head. So clearly there was something going on, but who's paying attention to that story?
Speaking of Islam, you guys mind if we get into that for just a moment? I had Gad Saad on my podcast, and he's very outspoken, of course, about this topic, and we got into this idea of Islam reformation. Do you believe that's possible, to reform Islam to be more, I guess, in a way like Christianity, and where people hold their beliefs, but I'm not going to say no one, very few people are out trying to physically force these things to happen by force, and instead are much more moderate about it. Is it possible to introduce an idea of Islam that is reformed?
Well, actually, Sam, I want to know where you are with this right now, because I know some of your ideas have shifted since your conversation with Majid Nawaz. So where do you stand on this issue?
Well, I guess I would distinguish between what I hope will happen and what I think is likely in any kind of time frame that we can be consoled by. You know, I hope it's reformable, and it's and I don't really. I mean, this is Majid's line. Most of you probably know who Majid Nawaz is, but he was my collaborator on this book, Islam and the Future of Tolerance, and it started out sort of as a debate, but then we converged on a lot of points. And you know, his line is, listen, if you think reform is hard, just think of what it would take for 1.6 billion Muslims to apostatize and become atheists. I mean, that's clearly a higher bar. So reform is the easier project, however hard it might be. The problem, and I think this is more where you sit, is that in arguing for atheism, intellectually, ethically, you're standing on very firm ground. It's very straightforward to argue for why you shouldn't think the Quran or any other book was dictated by the creator of the universe. To argue for reform, to argue that to accept the claim that the Quran is the word of God, or could well be the word of God, but then to try to parse various passages in ways that are more benign, that strangely is a harder project intellectually. It seems, and you're always at a disadvantage with against the fundamentalists, or the Islamists, or the jihadists, or people who are really taking every line seriously. You're at a disadvantage because you're not picking and choosing based on anything other than your modern decision about how you want to live. It's not God who's informing your hermeneutics of the Quran. It's your preferences. And the whole point of religion is to confound your preferences on some level. Your preferences are going to lead you to hell if you believe this stuff. I think that's. I agree with both of you, both of you sound plausible.
Do you agree with Majid in the point that it's more likely to see Reformation?
Well, it's definitely a heavier lift. Again, it's easier for anyone who's honest, I think, to argue for the atheist line rather than the reform line. But when you look at again, the analogy to Christianity seems relevant. When you look at what's happened to Christianity, it has clearly been moderated. Even our fundamentalists are nothing like the fundamentalists of the 14th century. And so, granted, we don't have hundreds of years to wait around for Islam to get its act together, but there's clearly some historical, cultural process that can mitigate the worst parts of a religion, even among the fundamentalists. And so that's the thing that I think Majid is arguing for.
Well, I think the assumption that what you need is 1.6 billion Muslims or whatever it is to apostatize is not a correct one. That's not what you need in order to have that change. You just need enough of them to feel doubtful about the religion, enough doubt that they can at least concede that there is another truth out there. There's a phrase that I hear pretty commonly, when I speak to liberal Christians or Catholics or Jews even. Well, they'll say something like, I'm a Christian, and the but would follow some way in which they separate themselves from what they see as common Christian practice or something that's inherent within Christianity. That's a very common thing that I hear among Christians and Jews. I don't hear that very often among Muslims. Instead, what you see is Islam has always been a humanist religion. Islam has always been a liberal religion. And so let's bring it back to its progressive liberal roots, which is it's a very different argument, and it's important to see the differences in those arguments. To say, I'm a Christian, but I believe in gay rights, is to acknowledge that while you are a Christian and while you follow certain aspects of this faith and you identify it or whatever, you don't ultimately think that it's infallible. You think that it is possible to disagree with your faith, and you think it's also possible that your own reason and your own moral judgment can get you there. So that's a really important difference, something that we don't see very much in Muslim reform movements. Instead, it's a call for, well, Islam always was this way, and in fact, the roots of Islam were this way. It's a sort of historical revisionism that, and weird interpretations to try and get Islam to fit modern human rights, instead of just saying, well, it doesn't fit, in fact, but I find some value in it, and here are the ways in which I depart from it.
Yeah, I mean, the clearest case, and again, I'm just following Majid here, but there are clear passages in the Quran that cannot be reinterpreted, and the one that Majid always cites is cutting the hand of a thief, right? So I mean, that's not a metaphor, it's not an allegory, it's not it's just, there's nothing to think about that other than God wants you to cut the hands of a thief off. And Majid doesn't try to reinterpret that or say that that Islam used to be so enlightened that it would never practice that. It's just it is incompatible with the way we want to live, and we have to, God has to lose that particular argument. I think when push comes to shove, you have to do that. But the hope is that there's enough gymnastics you can do with some of the other stuff that is amenable to being reinterpreted to make it benign.
Well, there's something about that, but that's also a little bit, it's creepy to me in some way, that you sort of have to revise, pretend like you never thought otherwise, and now you see Islam as this liberal thing, and tomorrow when our human rights and moral judgment moves somewhere further, progresses further, you have to pretend like you never thought that it aligned with the 21st century and instead is now aligning with whatever future date. So there's this weird revisionism, and there's a weird sense of lying to yourself to make something happen that really isn't something that's happening naturally. And I can't imagine that that's productive to rational thought. I can't imagine that that's a healthy way for people in a society to think about, this incredibly important aspect of the world.
No, I would agree. I mean, this is the politics of emergency. This is not ideal on any level.
But it might be that there is no long-term solution, and it might be that a long-term solution, there is no short-term solution. That if there is a solution, it's long-term and it'll happen slowly. But we need to be doing it the right way. We need to be doing it in a way where it can actually last. But at the very least, last an intellectual challenge, which some of these, sort of ridiculous gymnastics that you have to play to get one word to mean another word, are not going to last that. And we're just sort of hoping that a strong force like ISIS doesn't come around, some charismatic demagogue doesn't come around in 100 years who can convince people that, hey, just read the Quran, read it yourself and see what it says and see the plain truth and come back to this true fundamentalist faith.
Yeah. And in defense of your side, Islam is different than Christianity in that respect. It's the opportunity to come back and say, here are the fundamentals. There's absolutely no reason to deviate from them, and then to sort of reboot something like ISIS. That is much more straightforward, and you could even argue inevitable with Islam, given the nature of the doctrine. With Christianity, it's harder because a lot of the pressure gets released with just the basic message of Jesus that he's not there to fulfill the law, right? I mean, there's a fundamental transcendence of all the barbarous stuff in the Old Testament, and what you're left with is you're left with a fair amount that you would rather not have, but it's not. I mean, even the craziest Christian cults are still just, at their worst, waiting around for the world to end. They're not actively bringing it about, and that's a difference that causes me to sleep better at night.
I love that. Yeah, I know that there's been some concern around that, because if you look back through history, anytime there's ever been some hard, rigid, you must stop doing this religiously, it just turns into a ton of bloodshed, you know. But the reform that has happened, for example, with Christianity, has been very slow, and a lot of people died in the process. You know, we obviously, like you said, Sam, we can't wait around for that. So what do we do? And I think maybe conversations like this, books like what you're doing, the obvious important work that you're doing with ex-Muslims of North America, that's why that is so important, I think, is because I think that's the way we get there, is through education and public discourse.
Yeah, yeah. And the point you made, which Majid makes as well, is that if you could just inject 1% of doubt in the mind of someone who would otherwise be a jihadist, you know, that doubt is good, and however you can get it in there, whether it's through a project like yours or a reform project, if you're just left with the feeling that maybe this isn't the perfect path to paradise, that's enough when you're talking about canceling the worst behavior.
I guess I would only disagree to say that I don't think all forms of doubt are the same, in the sense of there's what Majid is sort of aiming towards, which is we just reinterpret things and we put enough doubt in one interpretation that, oh, maybe all these interpretations can be valid, and the interpretation that says that when a man has a right to beat his wife, it actually means he should tickle his wife instead. I mean, if there's, those are not...
Also a bad practice, but arguably not as bad.
Yeah, and Gad was talking about how some are saying that instead of saying, taking the words that say kill, and say, no, kill them with love or kill them with kindness. I think
Right.
this is these are actual arguments people are making for this Reformation idea.
And I think it's absurd to expect people to take them all seriously, because there are times when the scripture is more explicit than other times. And with the verse that I was talking about, that a husband has a right to discipline his wife, it's really hard to get around that. At the very least, even if he doesn't have a right to hit her, he just has the right to hit her lightly with a stick. I mean, there's so many different ways that people try to, get themselves, into a more liberal position there. But the underlying idea is that a husband has a right to discipline his wife. Be it by scolding her, be it by walking away or whatever it is, he has the right to do that. That's the underlying idea, and that doesn't go away. And when I'm talking about, when I'm trying to advocate for women's rights or human rights, I don't want to start with that and try to mold that into something that is super feminist and
Yeah, there's no way to soften those words to come to a compromise. That just needs to be called out for what it is.
Right, so
I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, so to the extent that we should have doubt in the truth of the claim altogether, in the truth of the message altogether. That's a doubt that's powerful. That's a doubt that can last.
Yeah, but I think the fundamental claim that you want to undermine any way you can is this notion that revelation makes sense, the idea that certain books were dictated by an omniscient being. You have that is the foundation for all of these religions, and the moment you lose your purchase on that, then all the other dogmatisms that follow from that get weakened. So I think, and that unfortunately, as you know, in the Muslim world, that the certainty of the validity of that claim is then we're sort of back in the 14th century when you have to compare it to Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I know something that a lot of people look at statistics, they'll look at Pew surveys, whether globally or in America or in Canada, and they'll say, well, it looks like the nuns are growing. It looks like people are leaving religious belief. The problem is the people who are the fundamentalist religious people are breeding like rabbits. And so it's, even though the bad ideas are going away, the believers are making so many duplicates of themselves, it's hard to keep up. And so globally, even though we may be winning in the public conversation, globally it's looking like that the secular position is actually going to go back down a little in 10 to 15 years. And so I think I want to move the conversation for a moment to inspiring children to think critically, inspiring children to be science-based. Is it too early to start in kindergarten or first grade? How do we, I guess I'll pose this as the question, how can we inspire young people, very, very small children, to start thinking critically as early as possible?
Well, I would flip it. It's not that the question isn't is it too early to start? It's the things you don't start. If you don't start lying to your children or pretending to know things you don't know, then this problem never starts in the first place.
That's a great point. Yeah, that's great. Now, I did that with my own kids when it came to certain beliefs like Santa or the Easter Bunny. And then some will say, oh, but you're robbing them of that mystical feeling of magic land. You know, what do you say to that? Like, oh, let me have that for my kid to teach them that stuff.
Strangely, that was the most common question I got when I wrote this short book, Lying, where I argue very stridently that you should more or less never lie, that you should think about lying as the least violent thing you can do in self-defense. So you should put on the continuum of violence. But in normal relationships where you are dealing with someone who's rational, who is conceivably on your team, who's not trying to harm you overtly, well then I think lying is more or less always unethical, even so-called white lies. So I got a lot of pushback against this, but the most common, by a factor of 10, was, what about Santa?
Surely that's the one lie we can still get away with, right, Sam?
And I also heard from many people who remembered what it was like to realize that their parents had been lying to them about Santa, and they remember the harm it did to their view of their parents. They're carrying around this wound. But I mean, as far as Santa's concerned, it's like it's this one thing that, I mean, it's already the best holiday, right? It's already the most fun. You get presents. We have no temptation to lie about other things that are fictional and fun. I mean, you don't have to tell kids that Harry Potter really exists to get them into the Harry Potter story, or the Lord of the Rings, and Halloween is fun. You don't have to say there really are witches and ghosts, and it's just that you don't have to juice a child's capacity for finding fiction fun. But the deeper issue with lying is, honestly, I have only once found myself lying to my oldest daughter. She's about to turn 9, and it was totally inadvertent. We did a Google search of something. She was about 5 or 6, and the images are coming up. And if you're a parent, you know what this is like. You don't know what the hell is going to come up. And actually, so this is a digression. But my daughter just asked. She has to ask permission for Google searches because she's looking. She got really into iMovie, and she needs to find still photos for her movies. And so she said, can I do a Google search for schoolgirls? And it took me about 5 seconds to realize how bad that was going to go. So anyway, but we did this Google search, and an image of what was like a 14th century woodcut image of a witch being killed by the Inquisition, and in this case, having his or her head cut off, came up. But it was as benign a version of that as possible. It was just this old woodcut, and I'm scrolling past it, and she stops me. She says, "What was that?" And I just didn't have enough time to tell my version of the truth here, so I wound up saying that was a very old and impractical form of surgery. But honestly, that is the one lie I've told my daughter. I've never found it necessary to lie to her. And so everything that I would want to impart as far as critical thinking or skepticism with respect to specific ideas, all of that's just coming in by osmosis. I mean, she just gets all of it. I mean, she has the tools now, and she's not even 9.
Yeah, my mother regretted, even as a Christian, telling me about Santa, because when I did find out the truth, I was probably 8 or 9, as soon as she told me, I immediately went, oh, so Jesus is fake too. She was
I've
horrified.
heard from many people who've had that
She was,
experience.
yeah, she was horrified. And so I've always thought, you lie to your kids about the Easter Bunny, you lie to your kids about Santa Claus, you lie to your kids about the Tooth Fairy, and then you're shocked when they're 13 and they start lying to you. Like, where do you think they're getting this from? So I want to instill, what we've done in my home, my kids are much older now, but what we've done in my home is just encouraged pretend, but we call it pretend.
Right.
I mean, to this day, my kids are 13 and 17, and I'll still write from Santa on the package, and I'll never admit to buying it, but of course they know better. The same with the Tooth Fairy. We tell them it's pretend, but we continue to pretend. And I think that's a way to sort of, like you were saying, inspire that awe and wonder in the mystical realm, but understand it is what it is. So how can we then take that, allow them to have that pretend time, but encourage and inspire the science? I mean, obviously, we're not going to teach evolution to kindergartners. There's got to be a barrier. Do you have any ideas or thoughts on how we can inspire very, very young kids?
Well, I think it's just a commitment to giving every appropriate and fascinating truth whenever it's relevant. So that you have to calibrate what you say to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 7-year-old, but there's some appropriate version of the truth that is potentially fascinating. It's not, and I'm not under any illusions that every kid will be equally interested in science. It's just not, and heavy-handed attempts to make them more interested than they are, natively in any given moment, just at least if you're their father, doesn't work very well. You just have to make it, you have to represent your interests honestly, and again, it's just if you're never tempted to lie, or if you are tempted, if you become skeptical of that motivation, it just keeps finding its way into the conversation, and then you're dealing with a child who, again, at a very young age, is still is running some version of a reality check that is fairly adult, and which many adults never manage to get online. It's like there's a kind of there's a pause before believing certain things, and just kind of a checking operation that is it's very surprising to me to see it in somebody so young. But that is the basis of science.
We're all so interested in having our opinions heard and sort of being an outward flow of information that when a child asks a question, we so badly want to just say, here's the answer, or this is what I think is the case. And I think a great response that I've heard from a lot of people is they just say to the child, what do you think? Even some very liberal Christians who will talk to me and say, I appreciate the conversations you have, I appreciate your respectful approach, but I think you're wrong. I'll ask them, what do you say to your kid when they say, was Jesus born of a virgin, or does God exist? Some of them are starting to tell me, they're saying, I don't know, what do you think? And they're letting the kid explore these ideas. And to your point, what I did with my daughter is I would teach her about Jesus as a kid, but we would also teach her about Thor and Demeter and Zeus. And she sort of learned about religion in this overall concept of different religions. And we left out, of course, the beheadings and that impractical form of surgery you talked about. But we did sort of explain religion in that concept.
And the first part of what you said is also relevant. To be able to say, I don't know, maybe grown-ups are very uncomfortable saying that to their kids, it seems. And
you think they don't want to appear weak in front of their kids? They want to appear as this. I mean, look, they're going to find out eventually that you're not perfect, and so I think being able to say I don't know is.
Yeah, maybe you can just flip it. I don't know is the doorway to everything that's worth finding out. I mean, it is the basis of curiosity. And I mean, my wife Annika wrote a children's book about this entitled "I Wonder." I mean, it was motivated directly by this experience of just seeing our daughter pretend to know things that she obviously didn't know, and we realized that we had never taught her that it was okay to say I don't know. Like there was nothing embarrassing about not knowing. And then the pendulum swung the other way, and she would say I don't know to every question. like she was one of our hostages in Vietnam, just giving name, rank, and serial number and answering nothing. But now we're back in some sane place.
I can imagine your kids. That would be so much fun. Is your room clean? Well, what is clean, Dad? Is anything ever really clean?
Headed there, I'm sure.
I'm sure. So speaking of children, we've heard these horrific stories of, a child being sick or in some way in need of medical care, and fundamentalist parents laying hands on the child or praying for the child and neglecting the medical treatment. And a lot of times, at least in the States, what happens is the government will say there's nothing we can do at the time because, that's your religious freedom. But once the child dies, then they can say, okay, well, you neglected them from medical treatment or something else. They won't kick in the door and take the child for medical care, even if it's a preventable or curable disease or sickness. But they will, after the fact, say, okay, well, you neglected to provide that child with medical treatment. And so obviously there's this blurred line between religious freedoms and protecting someone from religious hurt and harm. So we all probably have different lines. I want to start with you, Sarah. Where do you draw that line between people having the freedom to express their own religion and practice their own religion, and then preventing a child from being harmed? Even something small like, for example, Amish will often take their children out of school at like second grade and say, that's enough learning for you, get on the farm and start working. There's different levels of harm. Where do you draw that line?
Well, it's easy to make the distinction in some cases. Like if you were to look at the female genital mutilation cases that are coming out of Michigan, and they're finding that there have been girls, 100 girls or so, that have been cut in Michigan, in the United States, and they're going through and they're trying to prosecute the doctors who performed the operations. And I think in those cases it's an easy call to make. It's easy to say that, well, this is a child, is a human being, and they have the right to their bodily integrity, and very clearly their bodily integrity has been just harmed or even destroyed in some cases, depending on how bad the actual cut was. So I think it's easy to make the case in something like that. It's harder when you look at something like the hijab, which I find to be quite harmful. I find it to be something that really just instills this sense of shame in a young woman about her body and about her sexuality. So it's very easy for me to argue that this is harmful too, but I'm uncomfortable with saying that parents should not be allowed to request or even push their children to wearing a hijab.
Let me ask you there about the hijab. Aren't there some women who find sort of a sense of pride in wearing it, so that if you were to try to say, I find that harmful, I'm going to fight for you not to have to wear this, would you get some pushback from women within Islam that'll say, excuse me, I find this as a rite of passage, or this is a symbol of my connection to God, or something along those lines, where they don't want to be protected from that and they find it offensive that you find the hijab offensive?
Well, I mean, anytime you talk about banning anything, you run the risk of turning it into from a religious symbol to a political symbol, and then it becomes almost more powerful. In a lot of ways, it does become more powerful because people who might not be religious to begin with might wear the hijab out of solidarity because they feel like this is that their Muslim brothers and sisters or their civil liberties are being infringed upon. So they will do it out of this sense of solidarity, and that's terrible because what it does is it covers up the actual harm that's taking place and the religious justification, which we need to talk about and we need to discuss and we need to understand why it's so harmful and why.
Do you think it's abusive for a parent to have their child wear a hijab? Is it?
It's interesting because I can definitely say it's harmful, but whether abuse is different because to some extent it has this connotation where the parent is trying to harm the child in some way. And I don't know if that's the case. And in fact, many Muslim parents, they think that they're protecting their girls. They think they're doing what's best for them. They think they're going to set them up for life once they've, taught them the values of modesty. So is it abuse from that perspective? I don't know, but it definitely does have a harm.
Well, it's also confused by the fact that in many cases they're right about how their daughters will be treated in the community by Muslim boys and men if they don't wear the hijab. So they are protecting them from abuse in that
context.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely true. That it's a rational decision to protect your child, not just from the hereafter and what God is going to do there, but the way that they're going to be treated in this life here and now. So from that perspective, you can even look at many Muslim homes. A lot of ex-Muslims that I talk to, women especially, the ones that were forced into hijab, and they'll talk about how it was their mothers who forced them to wear the hijab, who enforced these sort of codes on them, these modesty codes on them, who made them feel ashamed about their sexual urges. But if you look at it from the perspective of the mother is trying to protect somebody who she cares about very much, and she wants to make sure that her daughter has every option open to her, within that society. So it's a tricky thing.
Yeah, I've heard a similar argument. Of course, that's much less harmful, but I've heard a similar argument from fundamentalist parents who would want to lay hands on a child who is sick. When you challenge them with why not give them medication and pray, why not do both, they would actually say that's an affront to God's power. That's a slap in the face to God. How dare you think he's going to be limited or somehow not going to perform this miracle? And they would do the same way. We're doing it so that God knows how much we love him. And at that point, obviously, we would say that's where the line is. There's a clear line there.
It's always strange that they never do that with amputations. This is the website, you probably still exists. Why does God hate amputees? No one has ever successfully prayed for the regrowth of an arm or a leg, and everyone prays for or is tempted to pray for conditions that on their face seem liable to be self-limiting, whereas something like a lost limb clearly isn't. But if God had that power, you would be tempted to pray even there.
Yeah. The interesting thing is we run the risk of, I guess, advocating for legislation that would then go into people's homes and tell them how to raise their children, which most secular people are like, hey, let people do what they want to do in their homes, and but when you start bringing these types of topics up, I would advocate that should be illegal, that you shouldn't be able to do that. Well now, am I
religion? If you take the sanctity of religion out of it, and you just talk about it in terms of belief, right? And then you think it's clear. The state clearly has an interest, and we all have an interest in not letting our neighbors destroy their children. Because obviously, we shouldn't let our neighbors kill their children, and we shouldn't let our neighbors so harm their children that they become adults that we find it very difficult to live with. So there's some area there where the state and we all have an interest in intruding into the lives of parents who are parenting badly, and it doesn't matter if their motives are religious, right? So like the crucial taboo to get past, especially in the States, is this idea that, well, if it was a religious motivation for not giving medicine, or not. There's these extreme cases where
like blood transfusion.
The kid is found out to be diabetic, right, and they won't give insulin, right, and the kid dies. That's just straight up child abuse, right? So the fact that there was religion in the mix shouldn't confuse anybody, and it still reliably confuses our courts, and that's the problem.
Well, when it comes to Islam, I think the fact that religion is part of the mix confuses things in another way, in that people don't feel comfortable about bringing it up. They don't feel comfortable saying that FGM or honor violence is more common within Islam and people who practice Islam than it is anywhere else. And so that creates this just impossible challenge for people who are trying to address these harms and see what they can do what preventative action they can take. So say you can maybe train teachers and counselors or what have you to recognize signs of somebody who might be at risk for a forced marriage, for example. But in order to do that, you have to recognize that certain people are more at risk than others, and those certain people come from certain kinds of ethnic backgrounds or certain kinds of religious backgrounds. And those are things that people are very uncomfortable doing. They're uncomfortable with even touching that issue and talking about it and saying that this particular harm may be unique to this community, particularly if that community is a minority of any kind, especially with Islam. So that adds another layer of challenges to this.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to being unable to effectively define harm. Because you could say, oh, anything that harms a child, your belief shouldn't be that important. But then again, and as we're advocating for some sort of legislation to keep children safe from religious harm, we can use that word. They can say, look, what we're doing is actually protecting our child from hell or from whatever. And so they could advocate that they're, it's like, you get a shot at the dentist. It hurts a little bit now, but it's good for the overall. They make that argument that it's bad for the child now, but it'll be better when they're gone or when they're in heaven. And so then you get to this sort of fight of we're doing what's best for the children. No, we're doing what's best for the children. And then we have to advocate for legislation that would then go into someone's home and say, if your child is sick, you must do something with the doctor. Otherwise, it's neglect and abuse. It'd be kind of a scary situation, I think. I don't want us to come off as hypocrites by saying, let's advocate for this legislation that's going to tell you how to raise your children, when that's what we've been against this whole time is let me raise my kids the way I want. Don't force me to take my kid to a school that's going to teach them about religion.
Well, the school is also an important part of it. If the schools were sufficiently intrusive in what they taught, then you can outsource a lot of that to the state in that sense. I mean, if for instance, evolution. If the schools just taught evolution and there was no scope for religious parents on the school board to say, well, no, actually we should be teaching the controversy, then the kids, despite what the parents believe about the Bible and God and the origin of humanity, the schools would be teaching evolution and the religious parents would just have to deal with it, right? So I think that the state could intrude without ever having to kick in the door and change what's happening in the home. It could, and the same with the hijab. If schools wouldn't let you wear a hijab, then it wouldn't be on the parents or on anyone else to make that decision. There would just be, there's no hijab in schools, so
that seems like not a good idea.
Why?
Well, in the case of Muslim girls, you're talking about a population who, well, first of all, what would be the parents' reaction to hearing that their child, when they have to go to school, they have to take off the hijab? For some, it might be, okay, we'll have them take off the hijab. For others, it's we're putting you into a religious school where this is going to be allowed. Or we're taking you back home where, you don't have to worry about that at all and you can be covered. So this idea that we will necessarily protect the most vulnerable Muslim women, I don't think that's necessarily the case. There have been similar conversations about banning the hijab in certain kinds of public official jobs, where you're working in a government office, for example, that there shouldn't be a display of religious affiliation in that sort of a visible way. Usually these conversations happen with Europeans, French in particular, but I think that can be harmful as well, because then you're taking away just that another employment opportunity from a woman who might need it, for whom this might be another tool for her to be a little bit more empowered than she would be otherwise. I can't see how that would ultimately help the women that we want to do something for.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree that the French approach is too heavy-handed. I mean, I think the banning the burqa is, in certain contexts, I think you would need to ban it, but in general, I think I worry about the same thing, just isolating the most vulnerable people in the Muslim community, because there's, their parents won't let them see doctors, they won't let them go to school, and you don't know you don't have enough information to actually know what's happening behind closed doors. So, yeah.
Let's shift to a lighter topic, something that's a little more fun: white supremacy. Let's touch on this one a little. we might not be here long. I just find it silly anytime I see someone who's a white supremacist, whether they're wearing the hood in the KKK or they're marching and chanting how great and pure and perfect they are. And I just kind of giggle at them sometimes and go, you have no idea how much West African, North African, Neanderthal is running through your DNA. And the rest of us are just kind of off to the side going, what are you proud of exactly? Like, what's so great about it? So I wanted to open the discussion briefly about just, obviously it comes from ignorance, but where do you think this idea, other than the missing the facts, of white supremacy comes from? Where are these guys getting this information that they're special?
Well, I can't answer that, but it's interesting. The genetic evidence for our purposes, cut the right way in the last few years. I think it was about 5 years ago where they did the genome, the Neanderthal genome, and it was found that the only people on Earth who are 100% Homo sapiens are Africans,
right.
Sub-Saharan Africans. Everyone else was, your grandma was raped by Neanderthals or raped a Neanderthal. So you're part
not
Neanderthal.
often the word rape gets a laugh twice in a row. I just want to say it's very, very well placed there, Sam.
So that was really delightful, but it's useful to point out though that it could have been the other way, right? And that would be a taboo thing to be pointed out, right. In terms of political correctness. But yeah, that was fantastic.
But I have an opening invitation for any white supremacist who wants to come on Dogma Debate. We will pay for a DNA test to prove your purity, and we'll see how it works out. I would love to do that. But it's got to be the way they're raised, right? It's got to be that you're very, very special. You're perfect. See your beautiful white skin. It's all perfect. And they just grow up with all this ignorance of the data, right?
Well, yeah, clearly it is what you teach kids. I mean, everyone who's a parent in this room just needs to think for a moment of what it's like to be in the presence of a child who knows nothing, right? And you're in this position of filling their head with a worldview. And if you're a rational parent who has the interests of your child at heart, well, then you're just telling them, appropriate facts as more or less as fast as you can. But it just, and again, I'm speaking to someone who did not have a childhood of religious indoctrination, but I can only imagine what it was like to hear from your parents, the most authoritative authorities that exist for the longest period of time, from the moment you could understand human speech, to be hearing about hell and about the fact that you would go there if you didn't believe in Jesus, or you didn't believe that the Quran was the perfect word. And I mean, I hear from atheists who can't yet shake the fear of hell. I mean, they've been atheists for 20 years, but there's still part of them that was sufficiently indoctrinated with this that they, again, I don't even know how they process this as a conscious thought, but part of them is still worried that they might wind up in hellfire.
So this idea of being special or being better than other people, it's
another ideology that you can just impart to a kid, and there's no mystery as to why they would believe it when they turn 10, if that's what you have been telling them for 10 years.
Again, facts, I guess, are going to be the best ammunition against that. Just continuing to teach about, and I've seen there's some show where a guy went on and did he's a white supremacist, and he went on and did a DNA test. And when they showed him the results, he was like 14% West African or something. It was a much higher percentage than many other whites. And he just denied the results. He was just like, yeah.
Oh, I
wonder who put that out there.
There were Nazis in Germany and during the war who at a certain point found out that they were Jewish. That's a rather gorgeous revelation. But you're always vulnerable if you think. I mean, this comes down to what's wrong with identity politics. Really, if you think that the goodness of a certain principle, if you want to organize society with respect to things like justice and fairness, And the lens through which you are judging the rightness of any principle is your identity with a certain tribe, right? That's it. At a minimum, you're vulnerable to discovering that you're actually not in that tribe, right? Which is, but the problem with identity politics is that whatever you think is true or good has to be something you could persuade others of, and the only way you could persuade them is, because they are others, is to make an argument that doesn't depend on who you are, right? It's not a. I mean, that's what it is to reason with people, and that's what it is to actually have reasons for what you believe. And this is what was so brilliant about the political philosopher John Rawls's thought experiment. I'm sure many of you have heard of Rawls, if not read his books, but he talked about a conception of a just society being something we could all converge on if we reasoned from what he called the original position, or from behind a veil of ignorance. And so this veil of ignorance is, we have all of the facts of science and reality to work with, but we just don't know anything about who we are in this society. You don't know if you're black or white, or man or woman, or tall or short, or whether you have brain damage. I mean, you have no idea how lucky you are or unlucky you are. And so from behind that veil of ignorance, the burden is on you to come up with principles of fairness and justice, which you would agree to before you find out who you are in this society, before you find out that you're rich or you're poor. And to be reasoning in any other way, which is the core of identity politics, is to not do that, and to reason from the point of view as, well, listen, as a white man or as a black woman, I believe X, right? But that's exactly what it is to be biased. That's exactly what it is to have your principles undermined by self-interest. And it's clearly the way forward is to be doing something much more like Rawls suggested.
I'm being signaled that it's time to take questions, but Sarah, I wanted to make sure you didn't have anything you wanted to get in on that, especially it being white supremacy. I don't want to get some accusation, you didn't let Sarah ask, get in on the conversation about white supremacy. I want to make sure there's nothing you had to add to that before.
Well, I not much, in that I agree that it's just another form of a group of people finding a way to feel like they're superior to everyone else, that they have a clearer view on the world, and they're able to see things as they are, and they're able to manipulate the world better than anyone else. I mean, we've seen this in a variety of different political ideologies, and then we see that in religion, and it makes sense to me that for some people race would be a good vehicle. But I will say that I don't really like the idea of using DNA tests as, a gotcha kind of thing because it's viscerally fun to just hurt these people in some way, right? Like it's just like, oh, haha, right? But at the same time, you're not doing anything about the hatred itself. You're just using that hatred as a tool to just hurt somebody. Like, haha, you think black people are scum, but you're 1/4 black, so you're scum according to you, right? I mean, there's something a little bit dirty about like playing that game, and perhaps that's not the way we should be going about it, because the ultimate idea is that even if it were 100% white, I mean, it would still be a terrible way to think about the world.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, and I'm glad to know you think about me that way. But thank you for that. No, that's a great point, and I never considered it like a hateful thing. So I'm glad you brought that up. I never considered it to be like a thumbing at the nose, ha, you're part of this. It was really, my idea was more of a bringing people together to say, you're proud of what? You think you have this pure white whatever. There's no such thing as that. You're connected to everyone that you're being hateful toward, and hopefully that would help them bring their walls down and say, wait a minute, my hatefulness is based in ignorance. I'm proud of something that really doesn't even exist. We're all connected. We all have common ancestors. That was really my angle.
Yeah.
I would never
I understand that.
Like,
Like,
take that in a
there's
hateful way.
there's some way that you can use their self-image and their desire to find themselves as superior, against them in that way, and maybe that will lead them to think that, black people aren't so bad or Asian people aren't so bad if they find out that they themselves are mixed. But I don't think that it necessarily turns out to be that way. I mean, like you've said and Sam said, a lot of people deny the test results, and even then, you don't actually know if what it'll lead to is for them to reevaluate how they see supremacy. Maybe not white supremacy, but just supremacy based on racial characteristics. They might just reevaluate what percent white is acceptable in order to be, superior, or perhaps mixed people are more or superior. So it doesn't really tackle the underlying ideology, which is so hateful and repulsive.
That's a great point. Thank you. So I did have a few more topics I wanted to get to, but it is time for the Q&A. So if you would, go ahead and line up at the mics. Can they get some lights to be able to see? There you go. So it looks like this microphone right here is labeled number 1, and this is number 2, so you'll know that when I call it out.
You want to call?
Yeah, but I wanted to. All right, guys. So we're going to need to keep the talking down so we can hear the first question. If you would, please. Thank you. I got you. Go ahead.
Just wondering if space exploration, to any extent, might be able to take the myths out of the heavens. If we're traveling to other planets, eventually in other solar systems, is it going to be that much fun to pray toward Mecca? Is it going to change the way we think about life after death once brains are transplanted? Is there a chance radical innovation will help dissolve our attachments to religion? Will that help put the knife in it, ultimately?
I mean, you've got to think every little bit helps, but religious belief has been impressively resistant to, to take that rather clear point. I mean, when you read the Bible, it's fairly obvious that they had no idea what was going on up there, and they thought heaven was very likely up there as a place that Jesus could ascend to. They thought shooting stars were in fact stars that were falling out of the sky. So the disconfirmation of all of that, and the sense of where could Jesus have ascended to? I mean, it just gets colder and colder and colder, and then there's no oxygen at all, and no place to really wait around for 2,000 years up there. But none of that seems to cut very deep for the fundamentalists. They have some other way of not caring about that.
And I think to add to that, a lot of the argument is that this idea of God in heaven is outside of time and space. So the ones that are hardcore fundamental will probably stay there in the face of that. But like you said, every little bit helps. You never know.
Hi.
Hi.
Mr. Harris, I'm wondering if you could compare and contrast the anti-fascist movement that took place in Britain after World War II to try to stamp out Nazism with this new Antifa movement in the U.S. and what place it has.
Well, I have to plead historical ignorance about the details of what the anti-fascists were up to during World War II in the UK. I mean, I guess there was a very good reason to be anti-fascist at that point, and if you could have resisted fascism, one would have wanted you to do it in more or less any way you could, and then at a certain point, there was a very good reason to go to war against Germany, and I don't think many of us are wondering whether we were on the right side of that war. So there is a right side and a wrong side in some of these cases, certainly. And but in the case of what the so-called anti-fascists, Antifa is doing in the U.S. now, these people just seem like unprincipled goons to me. I mean, it's not a political movement. And it's a painful irony that the people who are reliably closing down free speech on college campuses now in the U.S. are on the left. This is not right-wing people. It's not neo-Nazis. It's not the people who marched at Charlottesville. These are people on the left who are making it unsafe for people to speak on college campuses now. And that's just, it's something we shouldn't have any patience for, you know.
So I'm more and more in my regular life out in the world talking with folks that have religious belief. I'm finding what I've come to think of as the lazy theist, where I think people in this room would agree with me that in order to get to an atheistic worldview, you've got to do some work to get there. And I know I'm finding a lot of people are defaulting into the theist position that I'm talking to. And they're not doing a lot of work. They're just happy to be complacent and kind of be a sheep in their regular life and follow on with this religious viewpoint. And then I'll get into a conversation with them and I'll bring up something like, the Ark in the Middle East, no marsupials anywhere but Australia. And they'll say, oh, I never thought of that. That never occurred to me to think about that. So they're not doing any work. This is that kind of lazy theist, and they just default into it. And I think those people are up for grabs for us, and I'm just curious if you guys have run into this in your life and in your conversations, and if you have a strategy for how we might pick this low-hanging fruit and bring them over to the side of rationality and reason.
Well, it's that's what we've been up to for a while. But I would point out they're lazy on both sides. They're also lazy theologians. They're not. It's not. Most of these people are not spending a lot of time understanding their scriptures either. I mean, they obviously fundamentalists and ultra-orthodox people don't have that particular sin. But there are people who are. I mean, the poll results on Americans' knowledge of what's actually in the Bible are just astonishing. And they don't know. Half of America doesn't know who delivered the Sermon on the Mount. It's just so. These are not informed theists for the most part, but they have a sense that has been imparted to them with the details held aside that you can't be a good person, and you certainly can't be thought to be a good person by your community if you don't endorse religion on some level, no matter how little work that endorsement does in your day-to-day life. There's a sense that the bottom drops out in your moral worldview if you don't at least pay lip service to religion. And that's something that we just have to keep proving to be false.
I would say, too, being able to ask questions, employ the Socratic method, some basic tenets of street epistemology. We don't have to go out preaching. You can ask enough questions for someone to realize they don't have the answers they thought they did. And I don't think anyone in here, if you were ever religious, was deconverted because you were called an asshole by somebody online, right? None of us did that. We deconverted ourselves by doing research and doing honest inquiry into our views. And so asking someone tends to plant those seeds and sparks that idea that maybe what I believe isn't 100% accurate. Getting them to start thinking that way, I think, is very, very effective.
Hi, big fan of everybody up there. I have a question I don't think I've ever heard answered before. You've addressed the idea that Muslim women are often marginalized, and there's issues of female genital mutilation and honor killings and all of these horrible things. But I've never really heard any sympathy for whatever role young Muslim men are in and what kind of life they're kind of forced or expected to be in that same kind of way. do you have any kind of input on how you feel that they're marginalized in their own lives? And if I could get that from Sarah first, because I think you might have an interesting outlook, but I'd also like to hear from you.
Well, sure, yeah. I mean, I agree with you that it isn't something we talk about too often, but on the other hand, it does make sense, given the nature of Muslim society and the relative freedoms that are afforded to Muslim men. For example, they can marry, they can marry outside, and they can marry a Christian woman if they wanted. They have that level of freedom, and a woman doesn't really have that kind of freedom. In another sense, women don't really have the right to divorce. In a traditional sense of Islam, what they can do is they can request it from the husband, and he can deny the request. And then you can go to like a mullah, and then they can, or a religious leader, and they can accept the request or deny it. And if they deny it, you're sort of just, stuck in kind of a bad situation. So I understand why women's rights get kind of the spotlight when we're talking about Islam, and it does make sense. But you are correct in thinking that there are ways in which it really poisons and harms men, and in ways that are specific to men. So the first, there's the just general religious harm that affects both men and women, just this way of thinking about the world that harms both men and women. But there is this idea that a man has to be a provider, and he has to prove himself in certain ways, and that can be quite difficult, quite damaging to their psyche, to their stress levels, and it makes it difficult for them sometimes to perform that role. And so if they can't make it into that role, then it says something about them as a man. So there are, sort of poisonous aspects to it that affect both genders.
Yeah, well, I think that covers it. There's a reason. It's not a surprise that we don't spend a lot of time worrying about how Muslim men are harmed by the view of women in traditional Muslim societies, but they clearly are harmed. I mean, they're not given an opportunity to develop what we would consider psychologically normal relationships with women as teenagers, say. I mean, crucial years where you're either surrounded by strong women who you respect as equals, or you are taught something absolutely antithetical to that experience, which is that you're taught to fear them, and you're like given this Madonna whore complex, and it's enshrined as just God's view of the situation, and it's a very dysfunctional way to view women, and we see the consequences of it, and clearly it's harming men, but it's easy to see that we should focus on the women first, because they're the ones who in turn are being actively harmed by the men in their lives. But as Sarah pointed out, it's also the women who believe this doctrine too who are enforcing it. I mean, the men can't do this by themselves. In all of these religious cultures, the women, this is not just a problem under Islam. If you hear about dowry deaths in the Hindu community in India, right? There are women who are throwing acid on the faces of the new bride who they want to get rid of. I mean, it's absolutely bizarre, and it's both sexes are part of the problem.
Hi. It seems to be extremely common these days for people to form opinions or make decisions based on emotion or instinct, and then only invoke the reasoning afterwards to try and justify that initial emotion. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on strategies that can be reliable to try to deal with that confirmation bias, or things that people can actually use in their day-to-day life to avoid that trap.
Yeah, I think it's good to just know that is something you and everyone else does at a minimum from time to time, if not most of the time. This is something that the psychologist Jonathan Haidt has argued for a lot, that we do this, especially on moral questions. We have this gut reaction of disgust, say, and then all of the so-called moral reasoning that comes online afterwards to justify our disgust is just doing that. It's just we're reasoning like lawyers, making the case for what we already feel, we're not arriving at this position first by a process of reasoning. But I think it's useful to ask yourself on any topic whenever you find yourself taking your own opinion seriously. Well, one, it's worth asking yourself whether it's necessary to do that. I mean, why is it that you seem to have an opinion about everything? I mean, there's a lot out there that you don't know much about, and you could just sort of bracket your opinion for a moment and wonder, how is it that you know this thing you seem to know, or how would you know if you were wrong? And if you can't answer the question, if you can't imagine a state of the world that would demonstrate the wrongness of that opinion, well then it's unfalsifiable, right? And it's a strange opinion to have, certainly to have strongly. So it's obviously it's easier to see in other people, in the things they care about, when you're just noticing them get caught, and it's harder to see in yourself. But it's good. This is why it's good to be surrounded by smart people, and to read good books, and to watch good documentaries, and to continually be in conversation with other points of view and other people who are doing this debugging on their own worldviews, because then you can just keep catching yourself being wrong.
Yeah, there are really two types of people, I think, that take advantage of that emotional decision-making process. And it's people who are selling you tangible products and people who are selling you bullshit. And as long as we stay aware of it, usually we can maintain control over it.
So this is a plea in the form of a question, basically. I want you, I was going to say I want you to tell me why I'm wrong with my worldview, but I need you to tell me why I'm wrong. And my son is here too, so even to say it in front of him, the weight of it all looks hopeless to me. The weight of ignorance, of delusion, from the opening film that we saw to the discussion of what it would take for 1.6 people to change their minds about their rigorous belief, the lack of people even caring about the truth anymore in the States, what we're seeing going on, which we hoped was over, that kind of ignorance and even reveling in ignorance, feels completely hopeless. Tell me how I'm wrong and how there's still hope.
No pressure. No pressure.
Well,
Good night. Good night. We're leaving.
First I have to figure out whether I really believe what I'm about to say, given my principle of not lying to you. Well, it's worth reflecting on how quickly things can change. And things can change, both for bad or for good. This cuts both ways, but things can change surprisingly quickly. And this seems to be more and more true. I mean, when you look at just, I don't know how in touch you are with this here in Canada, but in the States, our victory on gay marriage just happened in the blink of an eye. It's like there was a moment where it was sort of made progress, and then it got rolled back, and then it sort of looked hopeless, and then all of a sudden it was accomplished. There are many things like that when you look at relevant scientific breakthroughs that change people's sense of what is good or possible or what religion should be doing. The sky's the limit there, really. I mean, we can make gains that never get rolled back, or at least only get rolled back in some very fringe area where not even your average fundamentalist wants to go. So, I mean, the obvious case is understanding epilepsy, and this is the easiest example that I always go to, but there are very few, even Christian fundamentalists, who, when their child gets epilepsy, resort to just exorcism and don't go to a neurologist. I mean, if you care about your child in the 21st century, you take your child to a doctor, and it's not the average fundamentalist who resists that. And I think we shouldn't. I mean, part of it, speaking to you personally, and just how is it to sort of overcome this mood, you can spend less time focusing on the political trivia. I mean, I've actually stopped paying as much attention as I was paying to Trump because it just became psychologically toxic to me, and there was nothing to do with it. You know, it was like there was no benefit from it, and you can pay more attention, and you have to understand also that news is being selected for by the bad news is always rising to the top, and there's always enough bad news, given how globally connected we are now, to fill every news broadcast with seemingly the worst things that have ever happened to people every single night of the year. I mean, there's always going to be 10 murders that they could tell you about tonight somewhere, and most news most of the time is just amplifying that signal, and you're not hearing about all of the great things that are happening, and all of the technological and moral and political improvements that are happening that are not being rolled back and are not likely to be rolled back. And there is no question that we're living in the luckiest time to be alive in human history. I mean, that seems to be absolutely obvious. I mean, what other moment in history would you rather have been born? There is, my list is, there's nothing on that list for me. And so that is, you have to do a little work though to keep that salient, because what social media and the media in general is going to tell you is that the world's on fire and you should just get ready to smell the smoke.
If I may add to that, it's important to continue to remind ourselves that just because we're hearing about it doesn't mean that's the majority, right? We hear the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Well, that's the case, but it doesn't mean all the wheels are squeaking, right? So when we hear these types of things happening, like Sam said, it's the news. You seeing it a lot only means the news media realizes what gets the attention and sells the advertisers. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the way the majority of people feel. Social media is not an accurate portrayal of reality. It's not real life. It's quick, hot sports opinions on the latest thing that's very uninformed. And if you look at that and think, wow, these are real human beings and this is the way they believe, it can get depressing. It really can. And the last thing that I'll leave you with on that is just that for me, anytime I see a void, I get inspired because I realize that's a place where I can make a difference. And right now, in the climate that we see, there's a lot of places for all of us to step up and make a difference. So whatever your niche is, whatever it is, I almost said niche. See how I corrected that? Whatever your niche is and whatever you enjoy doing, you can apply that in some way to make a positive difference. So you don't have to sit back and say the world's burning. You can actively help move it forward because there's plenty of room for you and all of us to step up.
Well, I feel like you both of you covered my thoughts pretty well. I can only add the more specific experience that I have as an organizer of, one of the most persecuted, groups of people around the world. And I often think about the things that you just mentioned, and it's hard not to think about the likelihoods of it all. And I try in my own head not to play that game because on the first point that they touched on, which is that we are ignorant, and we should acknowledge that we might be able to judge a likelihood here and there, but we could be wrong. But as moral and good people, our thoughts should be on what the possibility is. And if there is, a way forward ahead of us that is possible and that is good, then we should be marching in that direction. We shouldn't stop and think, well, is this politically convenient? Is this likely according to what little I know about the world? Because there's so many undercurrents that are going on all the time that are invisible to us. In the case of the ex-Muslim movement, the internet has empowered us in a way that it's hard to actually talk about it and put it into words the way that which this community that was so isolated and so disempowered and was able to find each other and find hope. And I hear from people that are in the most dire circumstances that have reasoned their way out of religion and are working to help other people like them. And if people in Egypt and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia can do it and they can find hope and they can think that this is a world worth fighting for, then I can think that way too.
So go forth and be inspired to be active in whatever it is you're doing, sir. Thank you for the question. Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks. Question mostly for Sam, but anyone can take it.
Of course.
Sam, you've made your thoughts on free speech very clear, and I think most people here would agree with you, and I agree certainly with you. But I certainly do share Mr. Smalley's disgust for the white supremacist rallies in the U.S. Question for Sam, to paraphrase you, to use your words, what's the ethical bedrock that you would use to determine whether they have these white supremacists have the right to march, and is that expression of free speech, and where do we put the line where we say, well, you're inciting too much hate in other people, or do we use the line that we already have, which is if you're directly inciting violence or encouraging violence on other people, then that should not be allowed, but anything up to that point is okay for us to tolerate?
Yeah, well, it's a hard question. I feel like it's hard to know where the line actually is there. I feel like we have it just about right in the U.S., which is erring on the side of tolerating even the most odious speech and letting it, as you say, walk right up to the line of encouraging violence. Because I think, the principle there is that the best way to combat this is to let it expose itself and then to show what's wrong with it, to make it look ridiculous, to satirize it, to argue against it. But I think, for instance, these countries in Europe that have made it illegal to deny the Holocaust, I think that's absolutely the wrong approach. Because what you do there is you make martyrs of the few people who make it their life's business to get locked up for this crime, and then you drive underground this ideology and this language game that is inadmissible in public because you've made it illegal, and yet you don't know how many people subscribe to it, you don't know how many people are aligning with it, and you can't put any pressure on them apart from the pressure to not make themselves known for fear of consequence. So I think it's the sunlight is the best disinfectant principle, and I think that is generally true. And it's not. I don't like seeing neo-Nazis and members of the KKK march, at all. And it does strike me as ridiculous to see the amount of public expense that has to be brought forward to protect them from the people they are saying that they would kill if they only had more power. But it's I think we should be very slow to use the violence of the state to silence speech, and it really has to be at the point where speech seems to be the proximate cause of violence itself.
You wouldn't support. Just as a very quick follow-up, then you wouldn't agree with banning certain groups, like you wouldn't ban the KKK under those premises?
Yeah, I just don't think that's the right lever to pull. I think you should be free to be as obnoxious and as stupid and as reprehensible as you want to be, and then the rest of us should be free to criticize you, to ignore you, to not go to your restaurant, to make your life as difficult as it will be if you are expressing views that are dangerous and divisive and idiotic. And so I think the pressure should come from society. But the moment you give the moment you legislate against it, then a different machinery starts working, and then who knows what the next law is going to look like. Then it'll be illegal to deny the God because of all the pain that causes people. You know, the majority of people believe that Jesus is coming back to earth. Well, to deny that then is to offend a majority of the people in the U.S. at least. And why not make that illegal for all the harm it causes? You know.
I'll add one thing. It's just a little point. I was looking at propaganda posters in Weimar, Germany, that the Nazi Party put out, and it's interesting that there was at least 3 that I found, 2 or 3, which had an image of Hitler and then a cross over his mouth like a tape, because actually they did try to ban him from speaking in Germany at the time. And so the posters had this tape over this black tape over his mouth, and it said something to the effect of, the text said something to the effect of, there's only one man who is not allowed to speak in Germany. And then the insinuation was, why don't they want the people in power want you to hear what he has to say? It's a very powerful marketing tool, censure is, and it can't actually protect you from the bigotry.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're hateful, I want to know who you are.
Right.
If your views are that destructive, I'd like you to show yourself and speak up. And like you said, if we start taking views that we all find despicable, but if we take those views and we classify that as step 1 of violence, then all of us are subject to that.
Yeah.
Then we are now, as secular people, somehow causing violence to people that are deconverting from Christianity or deconverting from Islam, and then now they're going to hell. That's us inciting violence in some way. Then you get on a very slippery slope. So I expected to disagree with something that you said about it, and I was completely on board with that.
Well, the vast majority of
It's a fine
progressive
line to
movements too, like if you take a look at the things that we find, we celebrate today, something like like homosexuality, gay pride and everything like that. That's something that's part of our ecosystem now, and that's something that's normalized now. But there was a time where it was perverse, and it was the devil's work, and it was something that many people would have found completely abhorrent, and they would have and did try to ban and get rid of. So when you're looking at it from a larger scale, and taking a look at human history and the progress of human history, it's hard to know from where you are, exactly what would be considered the most hateful thing and what wouldn't. So you have this umbrella or this large net where something that would be considered progress in the future will be caught along with the white supremacists, and you can't, how can we know that?
I mean, there's a deeper principle here. The reason why free speech strikes me as the master value is that it is the only mechanism we have to correct for our errors collectively in real time. It's like if something can't be talked about, it still exists, right? And it's still operating, but we now can't talk about it. And so it's just the open-endedness of conversation on really every topic is the only thing I see that is getting us all to converge, politically, ethically, intellectually, scientifically. I mean, everything is running on the same rails, and the rails are conversation.
The moment you make something taboo, it becomes interesting. People want to know what's behind the veil. Why can't they talk about that? Okay.
Hi. I wanted to address the point about hopelessness. My grandparents were refugees from Palestine who lived in Syria, and I was born, and basically I was living in the Middle East on the other side of the planet when I started going on the internet. When I was in grade 7, I got access to a high-speed internet, and I started watching videos for Richard Dawkins, and I heard about the God delusion, and that was kind of the age of reason to me. That was when I started learning about, because I was an ex-Muslim pretty much, and I was in a conditioned environment that was taking me away to access any sort of or any form of thing that would shatter the reality that I was living as part of in the Middle East, really. And in high school, when it was found that I was becoming atheist and a bunch of other students becoming atheists, our Islamic department canceled evolution, and they came after us. They kind of like they threatened us of talking about atheism again, and basically I came here. And coming here to university is not also ideal, I would say, because when I come to university and I expect that I'm gonna get all the critical thinking skills that I'm gonna be able to ask any questions I want, I get faced by the Antifa, basically being the extreme left. If you disagree with socialism, you're a white supremacist, and that's another problem, I guess. Now, I think it's a phenomenal thing that me being on the other side of the planet and making it here today is a dream for me to actually see you in front of me. I'm literally gonna be texting my friends back in Qatar, telling them about how amazing this event is, and it's just phenomenal to me. The point I wanted to address is the free will part. I agree with you. I don't believe in free will. It makes me, though, depressed because I feel that, like on the Charles Murray podcast, if I'm pronouncing his name right, it's mentioned that we don't have that much control over how much we can change ourselves in terms of genetics and ability to be more intelligent and change our IQ. So it makes me feel very limited and unable to be productive or do much to change anything about life in general, in my life, I guess. So that point really depresses me. And I just wanted to sort of...
Can I speak to that?
Good point.
Yeah, because that's a very common feeling about the conclusion that free will is an illusion. Many people, I'm not one of them, but many people find it depressing. And I don't know if I can show you the other side of it, but it strikes me as, first of all, acknowledging that free will is an illusion, acknowledging that you didn't invent yourself, you didn't pick your parents, you didn't pick your genes, you didn't pick the society into which you were born. You're not responsible for your appearance in the world. And even the things you seem responsible for in terms of conventional responsibility, the kind of efforts you make to get things done, say, well, the amount of effort you're able to summon is also a product of your genes and your environment and the good conversations you've had or the ones you missed, and it's all just propagating forward. It's all just, it's just your corner of the universe doing its thing moment by moment, and there's no place to stand where you are the subjective you, the sense of the experiencer in this moment. There's no place to stand where you can own the totality of those causal processes. But one thing that cuts through is obvious bullshit like white pride or really any other kind of pride. Yeah, right.
White pride over here.
Might be the hair. I don't know.
Yeah, it must be. I knew that was coming.
That no one, you didn't. The fact that you're born white or black or any other color is not something you're responsible for, right? So you can't take credit if you think white people are better for the fact that you're one of them, and so nothing like that could conceivably be the basis of pride. But so it is with everything else, like intelligence, like just having an ability to get things done in this world. Pride is the wrong summary of your talents there. Gratitude is appropriate. I mean, when you get past, when you fully absorb the implications of there being no free will, then what you see is a world of radical differences in luck, for lack of a better word. I mean, you see there are people who are obviously incredibly lucky and people who are obviously incredibly unlucky. And insofar as you are lucky, you can feel grateful and you can feel a commitment to making the most of that luck. And again, you're making the most of it is more of the universe just doing its thing. It's not that that part is really you, but what you can recognize is that you are a work in progress. There's no telling how much you can change moment to moment. And years in the future, you have no idea what you'll be like. You have no idea what you'll be like by virtue of the relationships you form or the ideas that you have or the intense experiences that suddenly intrude in your life that you didn't expect. People change radically, and they don't change. I mean, their height doesn't tend to change. There are things that are kind of fixed, but it really is open. Your mind and your life is really open-ended, and it's a process of discovery, moment to moment, and nothing is fixed, really. Nothing especially important is fixed, and so there's a. I don't see it as depressing. I just see it as a circumstance where you can be gratitude and love and curiosity are always appropriate without free will. So anyway, I hope that helps.
So I know I'm going to disappoint many of you when I say we only have time for one more question. I'm very sorry about that. So talk amongst yourselves, find out who's the most important question. No, I think we'll just go with one more right here at mic 1. And
all right. Well,
go ahead.
So I'm currently studying machine learning at the graduate level. So I'm going to ask you a question about AI, and I'm sure many of people have listened to your TED Talk. So I believe I've heard you say that it would be truly tragic to not have any conscious beings in this universe. And as far as the linearity of time is concerned, machines have a higher probability of thriving than us, just on a material basis. But wouldn't you say that consciousness, it would be the ultimate existential threat to humanity, considering that in the analogy of us, I wouldn't say it's intelligence, I would say it's consciousness that we choose to just defy the well-being of the ants because we just know that we have a dominance in our just in our capacity of being. Mm-hmm. So right now, as far as computer vision and natural language processing and speech recognition, we're training them according to human benchmarks. But the thing that we should be scared about would be for this machine to ultimately know that I really am the most intelligent being in this universe.
Yeah, I mean that's an additional concern. I think the question of consciousness. Consciousness and intelligence are two different variables, and I think they're certainly separable in the near term. I don't know if they're ultimately of a piece. I mean, I don't know if you get more and more intelligent up to the human level and beyond, if consciousness is guaranteed to come along for the ride at some point there. I think possibly not, in which case, for me, that's the worst case scenario because it opens the door to the possibility of us just turning the lights out in the universe. I mean, biological life is the only theater of consciousness we know of, and if we create some mere mechanism for whom the lights are not on, and this yet becomes the most competent and the most powerful force on Earth, and it gets away from us, and it becomes fundamentally hostile to our thriving, as is the concern, well then we've created a scenario under which the universe could go dark, essentially, and yet you'd have these super intelligent machines propagating themselves and making paper clips or doing whatever they would be doing. And I don't really see the self-consciousness in these machines being an especially scary variable, because you could run the argument the other way. So it would be consciousness that would allow for empathy and other good things that we would want in these super intelligent machines if they were in fact more powerful than we are. But I worry about competence more than consciousness. The consciousness becomes relevant on the other side, where if you're wondering about the ethical implications of building machines that can suffer, well, then you're talking about conscious machines. And if we knew our machines weren't conscious and could never be under a certain paradigm, no matter how intelligent they got, well, then there'd be no scope to wonder whether or not we're creating a hell and populating it with intelligent minds that can suffer, which would obviously be a terrible thing to do, although it apparently didn't stop God from doing it.
Thank you for the question. Please give a big round of applause for Travis Pangburn and Pangburn Philosophy for putting this event together. Sam Harris and Sarah Haider.
You and I are predetermined nonsense, and that's okay. You and I